We're going to be working this lesson inside the Intro to Effects project, so that's where we've started out. Now, if you've been working with After Effects as long as I have, which is more than a decade, when it comes time to apply an effect, you may first find yourself going by instinct, by default, up to the Effect menu, which of course contains all of the effects that are available to you inside After Effects. Now, in my case here, they're grayed out. That's because you don't get access to anything in the Effects menu unless a layer is actually selected. So first, let's click here on the layers and make sure that it's highlighted. And now we go to the Effects menu, and you can actually see the effects now. But after After Effects 5, it's become increasingly less necessary to come up here to the Effects menu because although it does allow you fairly quick access to all the filters that are available to you inside of the application, there is a much quicker way and a much better way to navigate to those effects. And that, of course, is with the Effects palette. Now, I currently have the Effects palette pretty much by itself here in my workspace. You'll probably find it nested in with the Time Controls palette on your screen, but just to tidy things up a little bit, I've docked it up here with the Tool palette so it takes up as little room on screen as possible. But the Effects palette is a really great way to work. Not only does it allow you quick access to the same categories you would see in the Effect menu by just twirling open these categories that you see here to reveal the effects that you can find within, but it also allows you to very quickly, once you learn what effects are available to you, and that won't take too long once you've started playing around with the various effects inside of After Effects, you'll get to know the filters that you want to use, and once you know what the names of those filters are, you can actually navigate to them immediately by typing in keywords up here in the Contains field. This is actually a search function, but it's completely dynamic and very fast. Suppose, for example, that we wanted to locate the color balance filter, but we couldn't remember if it was in the Adjust category or the Image Control category, but we knew we wanted that filter. All we have to do is click here and start typing color. Now, the instant I type the first letter, C, you can see that the Effects palette shows us every single filter that contains the letter C. As soon as I type the letter O, it now narrows that list down so that it shows me all the filters that contain CO adjacent to each other. And by the time I get to L, almost every single filter that we see here has the word color in it. So type in color space B, and by this point I've now narrowed it down to only two possible candidates, color balance and color balance HLS, which stands for hue, luminance, and saturation. So this is pretty much how we're going to be navigating to most of the filters that are available to us inside of After Effects by quickly typing keywords that get us to the effects we want to use. I just deleted that away, by the way. There are other ways to view the contents of the list that you see right here. You can just sort alphabetically if you like, which basically puts all of the filters inside your effects palette into a single long list and list them in alphabetical order. Or you can sort via Explorer folders. On the Macintosh, this will say Finder folders. And what this basically means is the folder structure that exists inside your plugins folder that you'll find inside your After Effects folder will be the structure that's used to sort the plugins that are available to you inside the effects palette. We have the standard version of After Effects installed right now. We're not demonstrating any production bundle features. So currently the only plugins available to us are the standard effects, which are in their little folder here, and the Reg Incentives plugins. Now, just as a sideline here, the Reg Incentives plugins are 5 plugins, Card Dance, Card Wipe, Caustic Foam, and Wave World, that are available to you for free when you register your application on the Adobe website. As soon as you register your application, you'll be presented with the opportunity to download these 5 free plugins. If you've already registered and you didn't get this opportunity or you didn't notice it, go back and re-enter your serial number on the Adobe site, and it'll give you the opportunity to download these 5 free plugins. You're really going to want to do it. These are great plugins, and we'll be demonstrating how they work a little later in the series. But as you can see, Reg Incentives and Standard Effects isn't really that great a default way to sort things out. You could, if you wanted to, go out into Explorer or the Finder and create a whole bunch of custom folders and sort things any which way that you liked. But actually, the organization inside After Effects by default is pretty good, so the Categories setting is what we're going to stick with here in the Effects palette. Now, the Effects palette also gives us a quick visual cue as to whether or not a filter is 16-bit, the ones that you see here that have 16 on them, or whether it's still an original 8-bit After Effects filter, which you can tell by the lack of a 16 on the icon. And if this is particularly important to you, if you only want to work in a 16-bit environment, you can even have the effects palette only display 16-bit effects if you choose this option right here. We're not going to do that because that's not really that important to us as we go through this demo. We're just going to take a look at all of the effects that are available to us in the After Effects standard version. But sorting effects, viewing effects, and navigating to the effects is the job of the effects palette. How do we actually apply the effects? Well, let's type in the word hue to get ourselves the hue saturation plugin. And now how do we get it from here to this layer? Well, if the layer that you want to apply your effect to happens to be selected, as ours is here, the easiest thing you can possibly do is just double-click on the effect, and that immediately applies the effect and opens up the effects palette that you see here on the left. Let's undo that. Control-Z. I can also click and drag onto the layer here in the comp window. That works really great if the layer happens to be selected and in front, but if it's not selected, let's deselect this here, and let's duplicate our layer down here so we now have two effects layers, neither of them selected. If I want to apply this to the backmost layer, I can't just click and drag here in the comp window because it's going to apply this effect to the topmost layer. I can, if I want to, drag directly to a layer down here in the timeline as well, and apply it to a layer whether it's selected or not, and whether it's in the foreground or not. So let's do that. We'll just apply hue saturation to this layer. Let me delete that extra layer now that we don't need it anymore. And once we've applied an effect, we can now interact with it here inside the Effects Control palette. So the Effects Control palette, not to be confused with the Effects palette, which is where you actually get the effects. Anything inside the Effects Control palette here can be adjusted by just clicking and dragging on things. We can, for example, drag the hue of our layer around, change it from a darker red to, say, a darker blue by dragging that around 200 degrees or so. Now, you may have noticed as soon as we applied this effect, a little switch has now appeared underneath the italicized letter F down here in the timeline. That switch allows us to turn the effects off and back on again for the layer. You can also turn effects on and off one at a time by clicking on the same switch up here in the effects palette. This little F will turn the effect off and back on again. And you'll also notice that the effects also contain twirlies similar to what we interact with in the timeline that close down and reveal different aspects of the interface to interact with, and in fact can collapse away an entire effect. One other thing that's new to After Effects 6 is this pop-up here, which you'll see by default at the beginning of every effect. It's called the Effects Favorites pop-up. We're going to be discussing favorites in just a few minutes, but for now I'm actually going to open up this side pop-up and turn off the Show Favorites dialog box so that doesn't get in our way. Now, once you've adjusted an effect and got it just the way you like it, you might be tempted to close down the Effects Control palette and get it out of the way, which is fine. We can do that just by clicking on the Close box. But what happens if we want to go back now and say, you know, I don't like this blue, I want to make it green, and we need to get that Effects Control palette back again? Well, there's a couple of different ways to do it. One is to reveal the effects down here in the timeline. If I select the layer, I can always twirl open the layer, and I'll find the effects listed down in the timeline, just like any other property that I can animate. But I can also jump straight to an effect by simply typing the E key. That's the solo key for soloing effects. And that brings up hue saturation. That's the only effect we have applied. And at this point, if I double click on hue saturation, that will bring back the Effects Control palette. That's one way to do it. But that's a couple of steps. It's much, much quicker, I believe, when the layer is selected, like we see here, to simply hit the F3 key, one of the most useful keyboard shortcuts you can memorize. F3 opens up the effects controls for a layer. Whether anything is applied to it or not, it will open up the effects control palette for a layer. Just hit F3. So file that one away in your brain. So now we could adjust this back to green if we wanted to, or we could just delete it. All we're doing basically is changing the color of a solid, and that's not terribly interesting. That's not the kind of special effects that you bought After Effects to do. Let's take a look at another filter that demonstrates more of the kinds of controls that are typical of an After Effects plugin. Type in the word radio, and that should expose radio waves, which is a particle generator, and the particles that it generates happen to be shapes. We're going to be looking at radio waves in much greater detail later on in the series, but for now let's apply it just to see some of the typical controls that are available to us inside of AE's effects controls. Now when we applied the effect, the color changed on screen. Actually, the color of the layer didn't change. The layer itself went completely transparent. As it turns out, the background color I have set for this screen is a light blue, which will come in handy in just a second. But if I tap on the space bar, you'll see that Radio Wave is one of a kind of plugin inside After Effects that actually completely replaces a source with an effect that it's generating. And in this case, the effect that's being generated is a bunch of radio waves that are being emanated from an effect point in the center of our screen here. Kind of effect you see all the time in news stories and so on, and you can create it very easily here inside of After Effects. But this is a nice plugin to demo because it contains all of the standard controls that are available to you inside of After Effects. For example, a producer point, otherwise known as an effect point. This little plus sign that you see here and this coordinate system that you see here has to do with this effect point from which the radio waves are being emanated. I can click and drag that effect point to another point on screen, and that's where the effect is now going to be originating from. That's easy enough. I can also control it by clicking and dragging on the values that you see here in the effects palette, or I can click on the effects point icon and target someplace directly on screen just by clicking, or I can click once, release my mouse, and I can use the arrow keys to actually nudge a pixel at a time the effect point on screen so that I can precisely put it exactly where I want it to go. Hit return when you're done, and the effect point will now jump directly to that point. Now, the next type of control that is exemplified in this plugin is the pop-up control. The pop-up control allows you to choose an absolute value, some kind of a state that you're choosing that will determine how the plugin renders. Typically, pop-ups either don't allow you to animate them, or they only animate with hold keyframes. They essentially snap from one state to another. Pop-ups are usually used when there's no way to interpolate between one kind of condition and another. That, I think, will be obvious to you as we move along through the lessons. The next type of control is a slider. A slider is kind of a visual version of the scrubbing controls that we have available to us by just clicking and dragging on the numbers that are available to us up here. But a slider can actually be a very, very useful thing that allows us to hone in on a particular range and constrain ourselves to that range, because you can't actually drag a slider beyond either of the extremes that are set in the slider control. And this is such an incredibly useful thing to be able to do that you can actually customize sliders. If you right-click on Windows or Control-click on the Mac on the name of the slider that you want to modify, you can actually choose Edit Value, which you might believe is just a way of entering a direct value, which it is, but it also allows you to customize the slider range. So if, for example, we only wanted, for speed reasons, a quality range from 1 to 4, we could enter that directly here with a slider range, click OK, and now our slider only goes from 1 to 4. So you can actually customize effects on the fly to suit your needs. Now, sliders we're going to be interacting with for the next several hours, so I'm not going to go into much more detail about that. Now, the next type of control available to us in default plugins is the switch. A switch is simply a little empty square or a square with a check mark in it. The check mark indicates that the switch is on. The empty square indicates that the switch is off. In many cases, enabling a switch will also enable other controls that may otherwise be grayed out. For example, the star depth control is not available for us to work with until we actually turn on the star switch, at which point the star depth becomes an active control. Turn that back off again because that's kind of hard to look at. The next kind of control that's typical of effects is a direction control. This is a different kind of twirly other than the little triangles that you twirl down. This one you click and you twirl around, and it adjusts the direction that things occur on screen. We aren't seeing anything happen as we make these adjustments, and I'll explain a lot more about how this particular plugin works later, but for now I'm just going to crank our velocity settings way up, and that'll allow us to see that the direction slider is actually controlling the direction in which our polygons are now being created. So the direction control, again, is an interactive way to set an angle or even a number of rotations, just like the rotation controls we've seen down on the timeline. The last typical control inside of After Effects is the color chip, and this, of course, allows you to choose or even animate a color for a particular effect. You can also use an eyedropper to choose a color from anywhere in the screen that you like. We're just going to stick with blue here for now. Now, if you click on the chip, it's going to open up your system's color picker, at which point you can choose whatever color that you like for a particular effect. You can also scrub colors. It doesn't work, however, here in the Effects control palette. If I click and drag on this color chip, nothing happens. But if I right-click on the word color, or Control-click on the Mac, and choose Reveal in Timeline, you can see now down here in the timeline, the color chip is clearly available. And if I click and drag on the color chip, I can actually scrub the color values. Just by clicking and dragging right and left, I'll change the color. By dragging up and down, I'll affect the saturation of the color. So you can scrub directly to the values that you want just by interacting down in the timeline, which is a really great new feature. Let me undo that. And of course, all of these things can be animated. Anything that has a stopwatch next to it, at any rate, can be animated. If, for example, I hit the Home key to jump back to frame 0, let's scroll up to the top of our window here. What if we wanted to animate the producer point so that we were animating the birth point of the radio waves on screen? Well, we can clearly see now one of the tricks of working with effects, and that is my effects point has disappeared. All I can see here on screen now, even though I've got radio waves applied, is my anchor point, which would allow me to move the layer, which I don't want to do, and the control points around the outside. Where did the effect point go for the effect? Well, it turns out that the custom controls for effects inside a layer are only visible if the effect itself is selected. So we have somehow deselected our effect. This is very easy to do, obviously. Just click on the effect again, and the effect controls come back. Any custom effect controls that appear in the layer window will reappear if you reselect an effect. So let's drag this up to the top of the screen. Set a keyframe for our producer point just by clicking on the stopwatch. Let me hit Shift Page Down a couple of times. Move our effect point down. Hit Shift Page Down a couple more times to move our effect point back up again. And now it's very difficult to see what's going on screen here. Let me actually go down. Again, we're going to be explaining this filter in greater detail later, but just for now, stick with me. Go to Wave Motion. Let's crank up this frequency amount to something a bit higher that will allow us to see the animation that we've just created. And watch as I drag here, you can see the effect point moving down, and as the effect point goes down, it is emitting little circles that are now moving off screen right. There we go. And if I hit the U key, remember the Uber key that solos only the animated properties, I can clearly see the 3 keyframes that I've now set for myself down here in the timeline. But even if I select the producer point property here and select the keyframes, something is missing from our window up here. The thing that's missing is the path that this point travels along. When we're adjusting the motion of a layer, we clearly get a Bezier path that we can go back and tweak. What if we want to go back and tweak a path on an effect? How do we actually do that? We can't see any visual representation of the path here in the comp window. That is a byproduct of one of the eccentricities of working in After Effects, something that you really just have to wrap your brain around and get used to, and that is effects are relative to the layer, while layers are relative to the comp. So that when you need to adjust an effect's path, don't look in the comp window, look in the layer window. With our layer selected, we'll just hit the return key to open up the layer window, and there it is. Let me tab my palettes away here, and you can very clearly not only see the path, but you can see the effect itself being displayed here in the layer window. This is something else that's completely new in After Effects 6. Effects never showed up in the layer window before, but now they can. They can as long as you choose them in the little view pop-up that you see down here. We could just say View None, and it'll show us the original layer, which was the dark red layer. Or we could view masks if we wanted to, or the anchor point path. These are things that we've seen before in our discussion of the layer window. But when you choose the actual effect, it not only shows you the effect control paths and lets you adjust them, but it also shows you the effect itself being rendered inside the layer window, which it never did before. So, cool new feature in After Effects 6. We close that down. And let's actually get rid of this filter. We'll be coming back to it in much greater detail later. It can do some really fun things. Let's actually create something that looks a little more like a finished effect. Let me tab our palettes back, and let's start with the checkerboard filter. This is a new effect in After Effects 6, available in the render settings. checkerboard, we'll just apply that, and you'll see we immediately get something that looks like transparency settings inside After Effects, but in fact we're actually rendering the checkerboard that we see right here. If I adjust the width settings, you can see that we can crank this up to something a little bit larger. That looks pretty good, something around 91 or so. Now, a quick glance at our checkerboard backgrounds, our transparent background, will tell us that we're only rendering white squares, and we're rendering them on transparent. That's the default setting of the checkerboard filter. Again, we'll probably come back and look at this in more detail, but for now let me show you that we have available to us a few blending modes, including normal instead of none, which will actually composite this white checkerboard over the original layer. Unfortunately, our original layer was a dark red, not black, and I don't necessarily want to fill the layer with dark red. Now, this is the original layer color, so it's a really easy thing to do to hit Control-Shift-Y on the PC, Command-Shift-Y on the Mac, which will bring up our solid settings and allow us to quickly pick another color. Just pick black, click OK, click OK, and now you'll see we have a nice black and white checkerboard. That's a start. Let me collapse down the checkerboard, and now let's type in TURB, and that's all I need to type in to reveal turbulent displace, which is a displacement map plugin that generates automatic fractal-based displacement. Let me drag that onto our layer, and you'll see we're starting to get a little bit of waviness. I'm going to tab my palettes away just long enough to shrink our layer down a bit. I want our layer to be smaller in the window than the entire composition so that we can see our edges as well. And once again, we'll talk about this filter in more detail later. But I wanted to just make a couple of quick adjustments here. Instead of pinning all, I want to only pin the left-hand side of this animation. Pinning means the distortion isn't going to happen on this left edge, but it's going to happen on all of the other edges now that I've told it to only pin left. And now that I've turned off pin all, I can tell it to resize the layer. And what that means is the effect is now free to grow beyond the edges of the boundary that we see here. And when I click on Resize Layer, you'll see that now this distorted layer is actually flapping along outside of the edges of our layer. Or it would be if we were actually animating the fractal at this point. A quick tap of the spacebar, however, shows us that we got nothing. Unlike radio waves, this is an example of a plugin that needs a little more feedback before it actually generates animation. Making sure that we're back at frame 0, let's set keyframes for evolution and for offset. Evolution is going to evolve the fractal over time, the fractal on which our displacement is based, and offset is going to move that displacement through our layer. So if I now jump to the end of our composition and I drag the X offset value, you'll see that it's actually moving the displacement through our flag as I click and drag. If I add the Shift key, I can move quite a bit and drag this displacement over 5 seconds quite far. So that's going to create a pretty good waving flag effect already. And if we want to evolve our fractal somewhat over time in the meanwhile, change the evolution of the noise itself, it'll add even a little bit more effectiveness to our waving animation. Last thing I want to add to this effect to sell it, let me close down the turbulent displacement and tab back our effects palette. I'm going to now type in trans, which brings up the transform filter, which we will add to the mix. And all I want to do with the transform filter is skew our flag a little bit so it looks like it's leaning. I'm going to adjust our skew axis so that it's 90 degrees to the right. And by clicking and dragging on the skew, I'll tilt our flag a little bit. Now I also want to affect the scale of it. I want to shrink it down just a little bit because it's starting to take on more of a diamond shape and I want it to be much wider than it is tall. So let's turn off uniform scale and just adjust down the scale height. And now we've got a pretty decent finished effect that if I click and drag, we've got an angled flag doing its thing. Now we haven't gone into any real great detail about any one of these filters. We've just sort of shown how 3 effects added together fairly quickly can create a pretty good finished animation. But what may not be obvious to you, particularly if you come from the parametric effect world of Photoshop, where you have things like live drop shadows and live fill effects, etc., but no control over the order in which they're applied, well, in After Effects, the order in which things is applied is extremely important. This effect will only work and produce this result if these 3 effects happen in the order that you see them here in the effects palette. For example, I can quickly turn off the second two effects to return us to our original effect. The checkerboard is applied first, followed by the turbulent displace, followed by the transform. But you're free to rearrange things here in the effects palette. Let's see what happens if we just change the order of things. If, for example, the turbulent displace happens before the checkerboard, well, the waving just completely goes away. The turbulent displace only waves the original black layer, right? Which is then followed by a checkerboard, which is, by the way, now sized to the grown layer because we gave the layer permission to grow beyond its borders, and followed that by the transform effect. The result does not look anything like a waving flag. So obviously, the order in which things take place in After Effects is just as important here in the effects palette as it is in the timeline as we discussed back in set 1. And that brings us to another important topic, and that is the idea of favorites. Now that we've done this work, now that we've added a whole bunch of filters and created a waving flag, we might want to actually save this collection of filters, name it something like checkered flag, so that we can apply it again really, really simply in the future. That's where favorites come in, and that's where the next composition comes in. Let's close down this comp. Let's open up our favorites composition. Now here we have just a couple of simple layers. The background layer is a three-dimensional layer. We haven't really talked much about 3D yet, but this is a layer with the grid filter applied to it, rotated in 3D to create this perspective background. And floating in front of it is this matrix sphere. This is a fractal noise effect, believe it or not. One of the presets in fractal noise gives you these rectangular patterns, followed by find edges, followed by a sphere filter, which is not a built-in After Effects filter, which is why I pre-rendered this movie. And it, of course, has an alpha channel so that it's floating on a transparent background, and we've composited it in front of our grid. But what if we wanted to add, say, a glow around our sphere? Now, you might go to the effects palette and type in glow, but in the standard version of After Effects, you're not going to get anything. And in fact, in the production bundle of After Effects, you're going to get a filter that's designed to make the pixels inside of an image glow in really beautiful ways, but it's not really optimized to create a typical Photoshop glow where you basically have a fuzzy color bleeding around the alpha channel of an object. For that, we're actually going to have to create a custom cluster of a handful of effects. And because it's such an infinitely useful thing to have around, we're actually going to save that as a favorite. So let's very, very quickly create a glowing effect around our sphere. We're going to basically stack up a few effects here to create our final effect. Let's start out with the fill effect. This allows you to just fill any foreground with a solid color. Red is the default, but that's not what we're going to ultimately want. Let's pick something more of a light yellow, I think. Click OK. Now the next effect that we want to apply is Minimax. M-I-N-I is about all you need to type in to get Minimax. Don't worry if you don't understand completely how all of these plugins work. Again, we're going to be talking about them in more detail later. But just follow along, take a leap of faith, and under Channel, choose Alpha and Color. And as we adjust our radius up, we're going to fatten up our layer a little bit. We can now close that down. Now go back to our effects palette and type in Fast. That brings up the Fast Blur, which if we add to the mix, allows us to blur our layer a bit. That's going to give us a nice sort of a blurred glow. And lastly, go back to our effects palette and type in CAL, and that should be enough to solo Calculations. This is a new After Effects 6 plugin that allows you to do a whole bunch of things like transfer modes, etc. in a filter. We're going to add that, and once again, take that leap of faith, twirl open the second source, and for the second source, make sure the Matrix Sphere movie is chosen. Turn off Stretch Second Layer to Fit, turn off Preserve Transparency, and crank up the second layer opacity to 100%. And what this essentially is going to do is it's going to add the pixels from our original layer back into the effect. And the end result is we've given ourselves a nice glow around our object. Now, none of this is terribly intuitive, particularly if you're new to the program. So you can actually take advantage of a cool thing in the effects palette and rename these effects so that they remind you what they're there for. The fill, for example, is acting as our glow color. So we've just, by changing the name of it, by selecting it and hitting the return key or the enter key on the PC, we can actually edit the name of the effect and type in a name that can help remind us of what the filter does. Minimax, for example, is the glow size. That's what we used to make our glow a little bit larger, right? Fast blur is, in essence, the glow softness. And calculations, an important thing to know about that is that whenever you apply this, you've got to make sure that your original layer is properly chosen in the pop-up, because that's something that isn't saved in favorites. So you can actually remind yourself of that in the name here by just saying make sure name set, whatever you need to put in there to remind you what the function does. The important thing is that you name things so that you can remember exactly what things are supposed to do. Once you've done that, select the filters that you want to now save as a favorite. We want to save all of these filters together and the results that they are producing. We want to save them as a favorite. Now you can do that in the effects palette by choosing Effect, Save Favorite. And when you do, it's going to, by default, prompt you to save the favorite into the Favorites folder inside your After Effects folder. This is an important thing. You want to do this because once you've saved favorites into the default favorites folder, you'll be able to access favorites from your effects palette as well. We're going to give ourselves a name that makes sense. Let's call this our Outer Glow favorite. Click Save. And now we can delete these effects from our layer. Then you can go back up to the effects palette and choose Recent Favorites. And you'll see the first choice that we have is Outer Glow. There's also a keyboard shortcut to access your most recent favorite. It's basically mash your left hand on the keypad and add the letter F. Control-Alt-Shift-F or Command-Option-Shift-F on the Mac. Choose that, and all of the effects will be applied just as they were before. Now remember, I reminded ourselves with the name of the last parameter, make sure that the pop-up is set, right? So we've got to go into our second source, set that to our matrix sphere movie, and it works perfectly. All of the custom names that we gave our effects are preserved, and essentially what we've done is created our own custom glow filter that we can now apply to any layer that has an alpha channel. Just make sure you change that pop-up in the last one, and now anytime we wanted to adjust the color or adjust the glow size, you would just go back into these individual filters that make up the favorite and adjust things accordingly. Now, favorites are such an incredibly useful thing to work with that by default, the Show Favorites option was turned on here in the effects palette. So let's turn that back on again. And when you have Show Favorites turned on, you'll see that at the top of every effect now, there's this new pop-up that says Effect Favorites. So anytime you apply an effect, you have an option from that point, from the point where you have applied and optimized the effect of creating a favorite right there in the effects palette. Now, for my money, this kind of clutters up the effects palette a bit. It means every single effect now has an extra pop-up, and I don't want any more pop-ups in my effects palette than I need. So I personally haven't warmed up to this yet, but I may change my mind as time goes by. For now, I like to keep the Show Favorites button turned off and just use the effects palette and the favorite controls up here at the top in order to deal with my favorites. It's really, really easy, and it's a great way to work. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here before we leave this introduction on effects is the idea of adjustment layers. If you're familiar with adjustment layers in Photoshop, you'll know that an adjustment layer is an effect that applies to all of the layers that occur below it inside of Photoshop. And in fact, it works exactly the same way here inside of After Effects. For example, if I go up to my Layer menu, choose New Adjustment Layer. There's not a keyboard shortcut for it, by the way. Just choose New Adjustment Layer. Nothing happens to the pixels on screen, but a new solid has shown up down in the timeline, and that solid is named Adjustment Layer 1. And now anything that we apply to this adjustment layer will affect the layers underneath. So if we go back to our old friend Hue Saturation, for example, and add that to our adjustment layer and drag our master saturation down, the adjustment layer has the effect of desaturating the entire scene. What may not be completely obvious is that adjustment layers respect the alpha channel of the layer they're applied to, so we can now combine things like masks to our adjustment layers to isolate portions of the screen that we want to affect. So if we grab our rectangular mask and drag in the screen here, what we're masking off is the portion of the layer that is, in fact, affecting the layer below it. And any layer can become an adjustment layer. You don't have to just select New Adjustment Layer in order for it to work. If, for example, we create some new text, let me select our text tool, I'm obscuring our layer here, so let me make sure that we're typing white text, and I'll just close this out of the way because the actual font that we use doesn't really matter. Let me click here in the window, and we'll type in something appropriate, say matrix sphere. Let me select all. I'm going to hide our text selections. I'm going to make our type a bit bigger using the keyboard shortcuts that we talked about earlier. Now, we can actually use text or any other layer inside After Effects as an adjustment layer. And you do that as simply as clicking on the adjustment layer switch here in the timeline. This switch that's underneath the little almost yin-yang symbol is actually an adjustment layer symbol. If we click that, our text is going to go away. But if we then apply an effect to our type, which we can do, let's type something obvious like invert. Yeah, that's a good one. Now we'll apply that to our text layer. You can still see its outlines in here, so we'll click and let go. And now you can see that our text layer is now inverting everything that's underneath it. So adjustment layers can be an incredibly powerful way to work. Anything that has an alpha channel can be used as an adjustment layer and affect the combined pixels of everything in your composition. Now, we covered a lot of ground in a short period of time there, but don't worry, this is just an introduction to effects. The next several DVDs in this collection are all about effects, so we're going to be going back over these basics again and again and again over the next few hours. So these fundamentals are going to get reinforced time and again.